The dust swirled across the barren plains of Montana Territory as old Samuel Hartwell gripped his weathered shovel with trembling hands. The child's final words still echoed in his mind like a haunting melody that refused to fade. "Don't bury me alone," little Emma had whispered, her pale fingers clutching his calloused palm as the fever finally claimed her small body. Now, 3 days later, Samuel stood at the edge of his property where the prairie grass grew tall and wild, preparing to honor the dying wish of a child who wasn't even his own blood. The year was 1847, and the harsh Montana wilderness showed no mercy to those brave enough to call it home. Samuel had been a farmer for most of his 63 years, working land that seemed determined to break every man who dared to plant seeds in its unforgiving soil. His own children had grown and moved to California during the gold rush, leaving him alone with his memories and his failing crops. When young Emma appeared at his doorstep 6 months ago, barely alive and clutching a torn piece of fabric, he took her in without question. She never spoke of where she came from or who her people were, but her eyes held secrets that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. Samuel began digging near the old oak tree that Emma loved to sit under during the long summer afternoons. The first few shovelfuls came up easy enough, but as he worked deeper into the earth, something strange began to happen. The shovel started to shake in his hands, not from his own trembling, but as if the metal itself was fighting against the ground. Each strike against the soil sent vibrations up through the wooden handle that made his bones ache in ways he had never experienced before. The earth seemed to be resisting him, as if it knew something he did not. As the hole grew deeper, Samuel noticed that the dirt he was removing had an unusual color to it. What should have been the familiar brown soil of Montana had turned a deep, almost black shade that reminded him of dried blood. The smell rising from the excavation was strange too, not the earthy scent he expected, but something metallic and sharp that made his nose burn. Still, he continued digging, driven by his promise to the dying child and a growing curiosity about what lay beneath his land. The sun was beginning to set over the Rocky Mountains when Samuel's shovel struck something that definitely was not earth or stone. The metallic clang echoed across the empty prairie, causing a flock of ravens to burst from the nearby trees in an explosion of black wings and harsh cries. Samuel knelt down and brushed away the loose dirt with his hands, revealing what appeared to be a metal box about the size of a coffin for a small child. The surface was covered in strange symbols that looked like they might be some kind of writing, but unlike anything he had ever seen before. The box was heavier than it looked, and it took all of Samuel's remaining strength to lift it from the hole and set it on the ground beside Emma's small, wrapped body. As he examined the mysterious container more closely, he noticed that the symbols seemed to shimmer in the fading light, as if they were made from a metal that caught and reflected the sun's rays in an unnatural way. There was no visible lock or latch, but when Samuel ran his fingers along the edges, he could feel a slight depression that might serve as some kind of opening mechanism. Against his better judgment, Samuel pressed his thumb against the depression and felt the box give way with a soft click. The lid opened slowly, releasing a cloud of dust that sparkled like gold in the evening air. Inside, instead of the bones or artifacts he might have expected, Samuel found something that made his heart race with both fear and wonder. The box contained what appeared to be a collection of photographs, but photographs unlike any he had ever seen before. They showed people dressed in clothing from his own time period, standing in locations that looked exactly like his own property, but the images had a quality of clarity and detail that seemed impossible for any camera he knew of. The first photograph showed a young woman who looked remarkably similar to Emma, standing beside the very same oak tree where Samuel now prepared to dig the child's grave. The woman was smiling and appeared to be pregnant, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Written on the back of the photograph in a delicate script were the words Margaret Ashford, 1823. Samuel's hands began to shake as he realized that this photograph had been taken nearly 25 years ago. But the woman in the image could have been Emma's twin sister. The second photograph was even more disturbing. It showed the same woman, but this time she was lying on the ground near the oak tree, her eyes closed and her body twisted in an unnatural position. Dark stains covered her dress, and her previously swollen belly was now flat and empty. The back of this photograph bore a different inscription, The price of knowing too much. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he was looking at what appeared to be a murder scene from over 2 decades ago. As Samuel continued through the photographs, a terrible story began to emerge. The images showed various people who had lived on or near his property over the years, all of them meeting violent and mysterious ends. There was a photograph of a man hanging from the oak tree, another showing a family of 4 lying dead in what looked like his own barn, and several images of children who bore a striking resemblance to Emma, all of them appearing lifeless and broken. Each photograph was dated and labeled, creating a timeline of death and tragedy that stretched back to the early 1800s. But it was the final photograph that made Samuel's blood turn to ice in his veins. The image showed himself standing exactly where he was now, holding the very same shovel he gripped in his hands. He was looking down at a small grave beside the oak tree, and lying in that grave was Emma's unmistakable form. The photograph was dated 3 days in the future, and on the back someone had written, "The cycle continues." Samuel dropped the photograph and stumbled backward, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A voice behind him made him spin around in terror. "I told you not to bury me alone," Emma said, standing just a few feet away from him. But this was not the sick and dying child he had cared for over the past months. This Emma was translucent, her form shimmering like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Her eyes, which had been brown in life, now glowed with a pale blue light that made Samuel's soul feel cold. "You found the box," she continued, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "Now you know the truth about this place." Samuel tried to speak but found that his voice had abandoned him. Emma's ghostly form drifted closer, and he could see through her to the darkening sky beyond. "This land is cursed," she explained, her childlike voice now carrying the weight of decades. "Everyone who lives here dies violently, and their spirits become trapped, unable to move on to whatever comes after death. I am not the first child to die on this property, and I will not be the last. The photographs you found belong to all of us, the restless dead who wander this cursed ground." "But you're just a child," Samuel finally managed to whisper. "How can you know all this?" Emma's ghostly smile was both sad and ancient. "I have been many children over the years," she replied. "Margaret Ashford was my first form, back in 1823. I died with my unborn baby still in my womb, murdered by a man who feared what I had discovered about this land. Since then, I have returned again and again, always as a child, always hoping that someone might break the curse that binds us all to this place." Samuel's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. "What kind of curse?" he asked. Emma gestured toward the hole he had been digging. "Long before any white settlers came to Montana, this was sacred ground to the Blackfoot people. A medicine man was buried here along with powerful objects that were meant to protect the land from evil spirits. But when the first homesteaders arrived, they dug up the burial site looking for gold. They found the medicine man's remains and the sacred objects, but instead of treating them with respect, they scattered the bones and sold the artifacts to traders heading east. The desecration of the burial site released something dark and hungry," Emma continued. "A malevolent spirit that feeds on death and suffering. Cannot leave this place, but it can influence the minds of those who live here, driving them to violence and madness. Every person who dies on this land becomes trapped, just as I am trapped. We become part of the spirit's collection, forced to watch as it claims more and more victims over the years." Samuel looked at the photographs scattered on the ground around him. "All these people," he said, his voice barely audible. "They were all you?" Emma nodded sadly. "Different forms, different names, but the same spirit trying desperately to find someone who could help break the curse. I appear as a child because that is the form that people are most likely to trust and care for. I hoped that you might be different, that you might be strong enough to resist the dark influence and find a way to set us all free." "But I'm just an old farmer," Samuel protested. "I don't know anything about curses or spirits. How could I possibly help you?" Emma's form began to flicker, as if she was having trouble maintaining her presence in the physical world. "The medicine man's bones are still here somewhere," she said urgently. If they could be found and properly reburied with the respect they deserve, it might weaken the dark spirit enough for us to escape. But time is running short. The spirit has been growing stronger with each death, and soon it will be powerful enough to extend its influence beyond this property. As if summoned by Emma's words, a cold wind began to blow across the prairie, carrying with it the sound of whispered voices and distant screams. The temperature dropped so quickly that Samuel could see his breath forming clouds in the air. The photographs on the ground began to flutter and dance as if alive, and the strange symbols on the metal box started to glow with an eerie green light. "It knows we're talking," Emma said, her voice filled with fear. "It doesn't want the curse to be broken." Samuel felt a presence behind him, something dark and malevolent that made every instinct in his body scream in terror. He turned slowly and saw what could only be described as a shadow given form, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Red eyes gleamed from within the shadow, and when it spoke, its voice was like the sound of graves being dug. "The old man belongs to me now," it hissed, "just as all who live on my land belong to me." "Run," Emma whispered urgently. "Get to the house and find something made of iron. The dark spirit cannot touch iron directly." Samuel didn't need to be told twice. He dropped his shovel and ran as fast as his old legs could carry him toward his small farmhouse. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the shadow pursuing him, a rushing noise like wind through a cemetery at midnight. The photographs scattered in his wake, carried by the unnatural wind that seemed to follow the dark spirit wherever it went. Samuel burst through the door of his house and immediately began searching for anything made of iron. He found an old horseshoe hanging above his fireplace, a gift from his son who had learned blacksmithing before heading west. As soon as his fingers closed around the iron, the sounds of pursuit stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence that was somehow more frightening than the chaos that had preceded it. Samuel clutched the horseshoe to his chest and tried to catch his breath while his mind raced through everything Emma had told him. Outside, he could see Emma's ghostly form standing near his window. She was trying to tell him something, but he couldn't hear her voice through the walls of the house. She pointed toward the back of his property, toward an area where he had never bothered to farm because the soil seemed particularly poor. Samuel realized that she might be indicating where the medicine man's bones were buried. If he could find them and rebury them properly, maybe he could break the curse and free all the trapped spirits. But first, he needed to understand more about what he was dealing with. Samuel remembered that Emma had mentioned the Blackfoot people, and he recalled hearing stories from other settlers about the native tribes that had lived in Montana before the homesteaders arrived. There was an old trading post about 20 miles north of his property where a man named Jake Morrison lived with his Blackfoot wife. Jake might know something about the sacred sites and burial grounds that had been disturbed by the early settlers. The problem was getting to Jake's trading post without being caught by the dark spirit that now stalked his property. Samuel looked out his window and saw that the shadow creature was circling his house like a predator waiting for its prey to emerge. Every few minutes, it would test the boundaries, reaching toward the walls with tendrils of darkness. But each time it would recoil as if repelled by some invisible force. Samuel realized that his house itself might offer some protection, perhaps because it was built with iron nails or contained other metal objects that the spirit couldn't tolerate. As the night wore on, Samuel formulated a plan. He gathered every piece of iron he could find in the house. Old nails, kitchen utensils, even the metal buttons from his best shirt. He stuffed these items into his pockets and created a makeshift belt of horseshoes and metal tools. If iron really could protect him from the dark spirit, then he would armor himself with as much of it as possible before venturing outside. Dawn was breaking over the Montana plains when Samuel finally felt ready to make his journey to the trading post. He could see that the shadow creature had withdrawn somewhat with the coming of daylight, though it was still visible as a dark stain against the morning sky. Emma's ghostly form remained near the oak tree, and as Samuel prepared to leave, she gestured again toward the area she had indicated the night before. Samuel nodded to show that he understood and began his careful journey across his property. The metal objects in his pockets clinked softly with each step, creating a strange music that seemed to keep the darkness at bay. Samuel made his way to his barn where his old horse waited, and he was relieved to find that the animal seemed unaffected by the supernatural events that had transformed his world overnight. He saddled up quickly and rode north toward Jake Morrison's trading post, keeping to the well-traveled trails and staying in the sunlight as much as possible. The ride to the trading post took most of the morning, and Samuel spent the time thinking about everything that had happened since Emma's death. He realized now that there had been signs of something wrong with his property for years. Crops failed more often than they should have. Animals sometimes refused to graze in certain areas, and he had occasionally heard strange sounds at night that he had attributed to wind or wildlife. The truth was that he had been living on cursed ground for decades without realizing it. Jake Morrison's trading post was a sturdy log building surrounded by a collection of smaller structures where Jake's extended family lived. Jake himself was a tall, weathered man who had come to Montana in the 1830s and had earned the respect of both the white settlers and the native tribes through his fair dealing and honest character. His wife, whose Blackfoot name was Flying Hawk but who was known to the settlers as Mary, was a woman of great wisdom who served as a bridge between the two cultures that were slowly learning to coexist in the Montana Territory. When Samuel arrived at the trading post, he found Jake repairing harnesses outside his workshop. "Samuel Hartwell," Jake called out with a smile. "What brings you so far from your farm? You look like you've seen a ghost." Samuel almost laughed at how accurate that observation was, but he managed to keep his composure as he dismounted and approached his old friend. "Jake, I need to ask you about something that might sound crazy," Samuel began. "It has to do with Blackfoot burial grounds and sacred sites. There's something on my property that I think might be connected to the native people who lived there before I did." Jake's expression grew serious as he set down his tools and gave Samuel his full attention. "Mary would know more about that than I would," he said. "Let me get her." Mary Morrison emerged from the trading post a few minutes later, her dark eyes studying Samuel with an intensity that made him feel as if she could see straight through to his soul. She was a small woman, probably in her 50s, but there was a strength and dignity about her that commanded respect. When Jake explained what Samuel was asking about, her expression grew troubled. "There are stories," she said slowly, speaking English with the careful precision of someone for whom it was a second language. "My grandmother told me about a medicine man who was buried somewhere in that area many years ago. His name was Crow Feather, and he was a powerful spiritual leader who was tasked with protecting the land from evil spirits. When he died, he was buried with sacred objects that were meant to keep the darkness away." "What happened to the burial site?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mary's face darkened with sadness and anger. "White settlers came looking for gold," she replied. "They dug up many graves, scattered the bones, took anything that looked valuable. My people tried to stop them, but there were too many, and they had guns. The desecration of Crow Feather's burial site released something that should have remained trapped forever." Samuel told Mary about the events of the previous night, about Emma's ghostly appearance and the dark spirit that now haunted his property. He described the photographs he had found and the curse that seemed to trap the spirits of everyone who died on his land. As he spoke, Mary's expression grew more and more grave. "The dark spirit feeds on death and violence," she explained when Samuel had finished his story. "Each person it claims makes it stronger, and eventually it will be powerful enough to spread beyond your property. If that happens, the entire territory could become cursed ground." Mary paused and exchanged a meaningful look with her husband. "But there might be a way to stop it. Crow Feather's bones must be found and reburied with proper ceremony," Mary continued. "The sacred objects that were buried with him must be returned if possible. And someone must be willing to make a great sacrifice to appease the dark spirit and convince it to return to whatever realm it came from." Samuel felt his heart sink as he realized what she was implying. "What kind of sacrifice?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "A life freely given," Mary replied solemnly. "Someone must be willing to take the place of all the spirits that have been trapped on your land. The dark entity will accept one willing soul in exchange for releasing all the others, but only if that person chooses their fate with full knowledge of what it means." Samuel felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He thought of Emma's ghostly form and all the other trapped spirits who had suffered for so many years. Mary offered to return with Samuel to his property and help him locate Crow Feather's bones. She gathered several items from the trading post: sage for cleansing ceremonies, a small drum made from buffalo hide, and various other objects that would be needed for the reburial ritual. Jake wanted to come as well, but Mary insisted that this was something that had to be done according to Blackfoot tradition, and the presence of too many white people might anger the spirits further. The ride back to Samuel's farm was tense and quiet. Mary spent much of the journey in what appeared to be silent prayer or meditation, occasionally stopping to examine the landscape and consult what looked like a small leather pouch filled with carved bones and stones. As they approached Samuel's property, she pointed toward the area that Emma's ghost had indicated the night before. "There," she said with certainty. "That is where Crow Feather rests. I can feel his presence calling out for justice and peace." Samuel looked toward the spot and realized it was less than 100 yards from where he had been digging Emma's grave. The irony was not lost on him that he had been living so close to the source of the curse for all these years without knowing it. As they dismounted near the suspected burial site, Samuel could see Emma's ghostly form appearing in the fading afternoon light. Mary seemed to sense the spirit's presence as well, though Samuel wasn't sure if she could actually see Emma or was simply responding to the supernatural energy that surrounded the area. "The child spirit is here," Mary said softly. "She has been waiting for someone who could help her find peace." Mary began to sing in her native language while she walked in a slow circle around the area where they believed Crow Feather was buried. The melody was haunting and beautiful, unlike anything Samuel had ever heard before. As she sang, other ghostly forms began to appear around the property. Samuel could see the people from the photographs he had found, all of them watching hopefully as Mary performed her ritual. When Mary finished singing, she began to dig in the spot she had identified as the burial site. Samuel helped her with the excavation, and they worked in reverent silence as the sun set over the Montana plains. After about an hour of careful digging, they uncovered what were unmistakably human remains. The bones were old and weathered, but they had been arranged in a specific pattern that suggested a formal burial. Near the bones, they found several objects that had clearly been placed there as part of the burial ceremony: a medicine pipe carved from red stone, a necklace made of bear claws and eagle feathers, and a small leather pouch that contained what appeared to be various herbs and stones. These were undoubtedly the sacred objects that Mary had mentioned, the items that were meant to keep the dark spirit contained. As soon as the sacred objects were exposed to the air, Samuel felt a change in the atmosphere around them. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a wind began to blow that carried with it the sound of angry voices and threatening whispers. The dark spirit had sensed what they were doing, and it was not pleased. Mary quickly gathered the bones and sacred objects, wrapping them carefully in a blanket she had brought for this purpose. "We must perform the reburial ceremony immediately," she said urgently. "The dark spirit grows stronger as night falls, and we may not get another chance." Samuel helped her carry Crow Feather's remains to a spot near the oak tree where Emma had loved to sit. Mary explained that this location would be appropriate because it was a place where life had once brought joy, and the medicine man spirit would appreciate being laid to rest in such a place. Mary began the reburial ceremony as darkness fell over the property. She sang again in her native language while she carefully arranged Crow Feather's bones in their proper positions. She placed the sacred objects around the remains according to traditional patterns and burned sage to cleanse the area of evil influences. As she worked, Samuel could see that the ghostly spirits around the property were becoming more visible and more agitated. The dark shadow creature appeared at the edge of the ceremony, its red eyes blazing with fury at what Mary was attempting to do. It reached out with tendrils of darkness, trying to disrupt the ritual, but each time it approached the sacred space, it was repelled by some invisible force. Mary's singing grew louder and more intense, and Samuel realized that she was engaged in a spiritual battle with the malevolent entity. "Now," Mary said suddenly, looking directly at Samuel, "if you are going to make the sacrifice, it must be now, while the ceremony is at its strongest point." Samuel looked around at all the ghostly spirits who had gathered to witness this moment. Emma's form was closest to him, her translucent face filled with hope and sadness. He thought about all the years these souls had been trapped, unable to find peace or move on to whatever awaited them in the afterlife. Samuel stepped forward into the sacred circle that Mary had created around Crow Feather's grave. "I offer my life freely," he said in a voice that carried across the prairie. "I take the place of all those who have been trapped here, so that they may finally find peace." The dark spirit let out a shriek of rage and triumph, rushing toward Samuel with all the fury of decades of contained malevolence. But as the shadow creature reached for Samuel, something unexpected happened. Emma's ghostly form stepped between them, her small body blazing with a pure white light that seemed to burn away the darkness. "No," she said firmly. "This man has shown nothing but kindness and love. I will not let him sacrifice himself for my mistakes." "Emma, no!" Samuel cried, but it was too late. The little girl's spirit absorbed the dark entity into herself, her form growing brighter and brighter until Samuel had to shield his eyes from the radiance. When the light finally faded, both Emma and the shadow creature were gone, leaving behind only a sense of profound peace and the gentle sound of wind through the prairie grass. Mary completed the reburial ceremony in the blessed silence that followed Emma's sacrifice. She covered Crow Feather's bones with earth and marked the grave with stones arranged in a pattern that would honor his memory and protect the site from future desecration. As she finished, the ghostly spirits of all the people who had been trapped on the property began to fade away, their faces filled with gratitude and relief as they finally found the peace they had sought for so many years. Samuel stood by the new grave as Mary packed up her ceremonial items. The curse was broken, the dark spirit was destroyed, and the innocent souls who had suffered for decades were finally free. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Emma, the little girl who had brought light and purpose to his lonely life, was gone forever, having given her own existence to save his and defeat the evil that had plagued the land. In the days that followed, Samuel found that his property had indeed been transformed. His crops began to grow with unprecedented vigor, his animals were healthier and more productive, and the oppressive atmosphere that had always hung over the land was replaced by a sense of serenity and hope. Travelers who passed by often commented on how peaceful and welcoming his farm seemed, and Samuel began to receive visitors who had heard about the change and wanted to see it for themselves. Samuel lived for many more years on his reclaimed land, and he never forgot the sacrifice that Emma had made to save him and break the curse. He told her story to anyone who would listen, ensuring that her memory would live on long after he was gone. When Samuel finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 89, neighbors who came to prepare his body for burial found him with a smile on his face and a small photograph clutched in his hand. The photograph showed a little girl with brown eyes and a gentle smile, and on the back was written simply, "Emma, forever in my heart."